So thanks for the introduction. My name's Malia, and I've worked for BCI for almost 20 years. And before that, I worked for state wildlife agencies and I worked for multiple universities. And really my whole career has been focused on saving species from extinction. And over the course of my entire time as a conservation advocate, I've watched agencies, state agencies and territorial agencies and tribal agencies struggle to find the funding that they need to protect species and their habitats from a changing world. And since the 90s, it's crazy. I've participated in these efforts to get dedicated funding to state and territorial wildlife agencies so that the species that they need can get, so that the species that need attention can get it. And for the first time, I've seen that this is really possible with the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is why I wanted to talk to you guys about it today. So I hope you're ready to join me in protecting our nation's wildlife and helping me advocate for its passion, helping me and BCI advocate for its passage. But in order to do that, I really want to give you some background and some information to help you craft your personal requests to Congress to help us pass this landmark legislation. So I'm going to pop up some slides, and Linda, will you let me know if my slides are going to come through okay?
Yeah.
Let me just share my screen real quick here. Is that looking all right?
Looks perfect.
Awesome. So you might be wondering, like, why this is so urgent. Why do I care about it so much? Why does BCI care about it so much? You see plenty of your birds in your yard, right? Some of you probably fence your gardens to keep deer and rabbit and squirrels from eating your lettuce. And it's true. It is true. Some species are doing really well in partnership with human development, but most of them are not. According to the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, almost a third, that's 30% of all US wildlife species currently face an elevated risk of extinction. Habitat loss, climate change, invasive species, and emerging diseases are all taking a toll on our nation's birds, mammals, fish, amphibians, reptiles, butterflies, bees, and yes, bats as well. All categories of wildlife are declining, many of them dramatically. For example, about a third of bird species urgently need conservation attention. More than 40% of freshwater fish and amphibians, like frogs, toads, and salamanders, are threatened or declining. A quarter, that's 25% of our native bumblebee species, face extinction. 70% of freshwater mussels are already extinct or imperiled. And yeah, bats are in trouble too. Over 50% of bats in North America are in need of conservation attention. This is according to the first ever State of the Bats report released by Bat Conservation International this spring. You can view the full report on our website at www.batcon.org, but I'm just going to give you a few highlights from the report. So from 2020 to 2022, we convened bat experts from across North America through the North American Bat Conservation Alliance to systematically assess the extinction risk of bat species in Canada and the United States and Mexico. Using criteria from NatureServe, over 100 scientists evaluated the scope and the severity of threats to bats and their population status. And the extinction risk of bat species reported here reflects the consensus of these expert opinions on the state of bats in North America. So from across North America, we've seen a 90% decline in species that are impacted by the disease, white nose syndrome, and 98% of bat species were assessed to be at risk from habitat loss. Experts identified climate change as a risk to 82% of the assessed species, and wind energy production poses a threat to at least 45 individual species. Of the 44 species in the US that we assessed, and you can see these little colored boxes kind of in the middle right of your screen, 7 of those are imperiled, 26 are vulnerable, and only 11 species in the United States are secure or apparently secure. So bats are in trouble, just like every other wildlife group. And so this funding is really urgently needed. Fortunately, across the United States, there is a national effort to identify all the wildlife species who need conservation attention and to think about what the best path to recovery looks like for every single one. For the last 15 years or so, every state, territory, tribal agency, and the District of Columbia have developed guiding documents called State Wildlife Action Plans, or some of them call the plans state conservation plans or something like that. They have varying names. But in these plans, each wildlife agency consistently identifies plants and animals that are in urgent need of conservation attention. And some plans even identify endangered habitats or endangered waters. So these documents for every agency serve as blueprints for conserving our nation's fish and wildlife and for preventing species from becoming endangered. And if you want to find your state's wildlife action plan, literally just Google my state's wildlife action plan, Florida's state wildlife action plan, Colorado's state wildlife action plan, and it'll be the first thing that pops up, and you can see what your state or territory or tribal agency has identified as priority species that need attention. The first round of these plans was developed in 2005, and it was revised again in like 2015. The next major revision is planned for 2025, and agencies are already beginning to compile information for each revision. Each plan addresses required elements that were identified and laid out by Congress, and they were developed in collaboration with leading scientists, conservationists, private landowners, and other members of the public. So they're very comprehensive documents that take into account a lot of different points of view. Nationwide, experts have identified more than 12,000 species of greatest conservation need. That's 12,000 species that are in trouble that need conservation attention. And although progress is being made, absolutely progress is being made, many of the fish and wildlife species continue to decline because the funding for these 12,000 species is completely inadequate. Currently, $70 million are appropriated annually by Congress, to implement those state wildlife action plans or the priorities within those state wildlife action plans. But according to the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, $1.3 billion in federal funding is needed every single year to actually implement the plans and keep these 12,000 species from becoming threatened or endangered, which would trigger action and emergency actions under the Endangered Species Act. This is 19 times the funding that's currently allocated. That's a lot. Think about it. It's like a family needing $5,000 a month to have food to eat and a house to live in, but you've only been given $263 and you're expected to make that work. The math doesn't make sense. It's impossible. So how are wildlife agencies supposed to take care of all the species within their states for less than 1/20th of what they need? Right now, we're stuck in this always changing, unpredictable annual appropriation funding mechanism that changes all the time based on politics, and it's woefully inadequate to keep species from becoming endangered. And it just isn't working. So what if it could be different? Like, I'm trying to imagine a world where that could be different. What would it look like to have enough funding to keep species from being listed under the Endangered Species Act? And how would it feel to have that funding reliable and predictable so that states could develop multi-year plans to support every species in desperate need of attention? This exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve. So luckily for some species, the news isn't all bad, right? Like for some species, this funding is already secure. In 1937, Congress passed the Pittman-Robertson Act, Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act. It's a longer name. This act taxes firearms and archery equipment and ammunition, and it reallocates that funding to state wildlife agencies so they can manage their wildlife. It also creates an incentive for hunting licenses by prohibiting the diversion of license fees paid by hunters for any purpose other than use by the wildlife agency. And I mean, this was pretty groundbreaking legislation, and the motivation for this act's passage was the decline in game populations, like deer and turkeys. And as such, although the act defines wildlife more broadly, Pittman-Robertson funding is really limited to birds and mammals. And in many states, it primarily supports projects that benefit hunted species, hunter access, and hunter recruitment. Since the funds are generated by taxes on hunting supplies, right? It makes sense. And from this experiment, though, we know that dedicated funding works. We've seen many states protect acres and acres of land as wildlife management areas, which benefit the species that are hunted, but also many other species as well. And we've seen species recover from dangerously low population levels. Species like white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, and wood ducks are a few examples of populations that have just rebounded based on dedicated funding and attention. There's a similar success story for many species of sport fish. In the 1950s, a similar act targeted to protect sport fisheries and provide funding to state wildlife agencies to support recreational fishing was passed, modeled off of the Pittman-Robertson Act. This one's called the Federal Aid in Sport Fish Restoration Act, but most of us just refer to it as the Dingell-Johnson Act, named after the bill sponsors. So like Pittman-Robertson, the Dingell-Johnson Act generates revenue from taxes on sport fishing tackle, fish finders, trolling motors, import duties on boats, and boat and small engine fuel taxes. Also similar to Pittman-Robertson, states match the federal funding with revenue generated from fishing license sales. And through this dedicated funding, we've seen sport fish populations rebound. It's really no surprise that with reliably delivered adequate funding, state wildlife agencies are able to work their magic. These agencies are filled with experts, species experts who can plan and deliver species recovery, and they can do it really well. Unfortunately, and this is why we're here today, the combined funding of Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson are not enough. And many species are falling through the cracks because they're not hunted or fished, or they don't meet the criteria for being eligible to receive these federal funding sources that are already established. There is no dedicated funding for these plants and animals outside of the appropriation process. This leaves wildlife agencies with an unfunded mandate to protect all the species under their jurisdiction, keep them from going endangered, but without the resources to even scratch the surface. And animals and plants in every state are losing ground, and some of them are at risk of disappearing forever. So for for so many years, conservation organizations and wildlife agencies have recognized this deficit, and we've been working hard to solve the problem. I think I mentioned this in my intro, like we've been working on this, I don't know, for as long as I can remember. In the 90s, there was an effort to pass legislation similar to Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson that would leverage a tax on outdoor recreational gear, like camping and hiking equipment, binoculars, cameras, bird seed, stuff like that, purchased by outdoor enthusiasts, and use that to fund wildlife conservation in the same way that the other two acts do. Unfortunately, this bill didn't advance, in part due to the politics at the time and the lack of support from members of Congress who pledged no new taxes. Like you might remember that for a while. That was a thing. And then again, in 2008, another effort was advanced to support wildlife called the Teaming with Wildlife Act. And this bill modified the funding revenue model a little bit to draw from drilling royalties and mineral leasing to try and provide a pathway for dedicated funding, and this bill also failed to advance. And then in 2016, we tried something new. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies organized a blue ribbon panel, something called a blue ribbon panel, which was comprised of 26 leaders from business, from conservation, and from outdoor recreation, and asked the panel to re-examine the current system of conservation funding, and then recommend changes that would lead to greater sustainability for all fish and wildlife. The panel was chaired by John Morris, who is the founder of Bass Pro Shops, and David Freudenthal, the former governor of Wyoming. So they already came at this problem with a slightly different mindset. The work of the Blue Ribbon panel led to another way of thinking and a fresh opportunity to finally secure dedicated funding for our nation's wildlife. And this opportunity arising out of that 2016 Blue Ribbon panel is what is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And so what is it? It's proposed legislation. It would provide $1.3 billion per year to states and territories, and another $97.5 million to tribal nations from existing revenues. So all total, like $1.4 billion to fund conservation, research, habitat restoration, outdoor recreation, and education programs. This is the number when we looked at all of the state wildlife action plans. This is what it would take annually to fund that work. The funding would be focused to help stabilize at-risk fish and wildlife across the nation before they become endangered, which would trigger regulation and emergency conservation measures. It also supports a healthy outdoor recreation economy. One of the reasons we think this bill thinks a little bit differently, outdoor recreation relies heavily on fish and wildlife populations. And the outdoor recreation industry contributes $887 billion to our national economy every single year and creates around 7.6 million direct jobs. It would work similar to Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson in that states would be required to provide 25% of the funding in non-federal matching funds. And the source of that match could be monetary, or it could be in-kind contributions originating from state or local governments, from private entities, other conservation organizations like BCI, partnering with the agencies, universities, businesses, private landowners, or volunteers. Like there's a whole bunch of ways that states could come up with their match obligation. Wildlife recovery efforts would also be guided by congressionally mandated state wildlife action plans. So those plans we talked about earlier would come into play here and focus the funding on the species of greatest conservation need. It would also accelerate the recovery of approximately 1,600 species that are already listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So those species would benefit as well. And best of all, the mechanism in place right now that's being proposed wouldn't require taxpayers or businesses to pay any more than they're already paying, but instead allow everyone, all Americans, to become investors, true investors in fish and wildlife conservation. So it's really exciting. The substance of this bill is really garnering a lot of attention. RAWA, which is the acronym for Recovering America's Wildlife Act, was introduced to the 117th Congress in April of 2021. And over the next 18 months, the bill worked its way through both houses of Congress with bipartisan support, truly bipartisan support. Led in the Senate by Democrat Martin Heinrich from New Mexico and Republican Roy Blunt of Missouri. And in the House of Representatives, the bill was championed by Representative Debbie Dingell, a Democrat from Michigan, and Representative Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican from Nebraska. The bill truly did boast bipartisan support, which is something really special these days, with 194 co-sponsors in the House and 47 co-sponsors in the Senate from both sides of the political aisle. It passed the House in June of 2022, so June of not this past June, but the one before. And it was poised to pass the Senate before the year's end. We really thought that it was going to pass. It had a lot of momentum. Most of the negotiations had been completed. And we went all the way to the 11th hour. There were several attempts to bring the bill to passage, but unfortunately, it never had an opportunity for a vote on the Senate floor, even though we thought all the way up until the end of the year it was going to make it. It never got that opportunity before the end of the congressional term on January 3rd, 2023 of this year. And at that point, the bill expired. That's how it works. So now we're in the 118th Congress, and we have to start over. That was a huge blow to the coalition, I have to tell you, and to the bill sponsors, the senators and representatives that sponsored the bill, and co-sponsored the bill, because everyone worked so hard for years to bring this bill right up to the finish line. I mean, we were literally like texting back and forth, like at the end of December in the middle of the night, thinking it was going to make it. So it was very disappointing. But you know, that's how it goes. And so we're starting over again. We're beginning the process all over again, but with a lot more momentum. And already more interest. So this time I'm really confident, I really am, that we're going to pass this bill. It's going to be life-changing. It's life-changing legislation. For wildlife, it is probably the most important piece of legislation that I've ever seen in my lifetime, because I wasn't around in the 50s or the 30s. And it's going to bring billions of desperately needed dollars to species, directly to species for conservation. So on March 31st of this year, the bill was reintroduced by Democratic Senator Martin Heinrich, again from New Mexico, and Republican Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina. And I just put a couple quotes up here from Senator Heinrich, because I thought they were really powerful. And he says, protecting America's fish and wildlife habitat means conserving the creatures we love before they ever become extinct. And this is what he said in his press release. And after all, our children deserve to inherit the full breadth of American wildlife, from bumblebees to bison, and this is legislation that will make that possible. And I couldn't agree more, 100%. We're also hearing that U.S. Representative Debbie Dingell, a Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan, will again be championing the reintroduction into the House. And we're anxiously anticipating that introduction. And we know that Congresswoman Dingell will make every effort to lead that introduction alongside Republicans who care deeply about protecting wildlife. So we are still absolutely confident that this will be a bipartisan bill. And really the time is now, right? It's right now to pass this legislation and to get ahead of the rapid decline that we see for so many species. If this decline is left unchecked, we're really in danger of losing the ecological benefits of many of these species and the tremendous economic value of healthy ecosystems. To cite one example, a bat example, of course, research shows that bat insect control is worth $1.4 billion annually to agriculture in Texas alone. And when you extrapolate that across the continental US, the estimated value of bats, ecosystem service of bats, approaches $24 billion per year. And it could be as high as $53 billion in the best case scenario. So this value includes reduced crop losses to insect pests, reduced spread of crop diseases, and reduced need for pesticides. And I think we all want those things, right? We all want fewer pesticides on our food and our food to be more affordable, especially now. And really, the Recovering America's Wildlife offers an opportunity to protect these bats that are delivering pest control services and their habitats all across the country, and in turn, benefit families and communities who rely on those healthy ecosystems. So there's a coordinated partnership that you should know about called the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife. Over 60 tribes and 1,500 organizations support RAWA, publicly and are actively working towards its passage. That's a lot of groups that see the value in this legislation. And that number is growing all the time. The Alliance is a coordinated partnership. It consists of members representing outdoor recreation, retail, manufacturing, energy and automotive industry, private landowners, educational institutions, conservation organizations, sportsmen's groups, and state and federal and tribal fish and wildlife agencies. And Bat Conservation International is proud to be an Alliance partner, working together hand in hand with the Alliance to get this legislation passed. And here's what's happening. I just thought maybe you would like to see under the hood a little bit, like what does it take to get legislation passed? And this is current, like I just got this from the Alliance coordinator yesterday. This is what's happening right now, this very minute. The Congress is in recess right now. And we expect the House, they're going to come back, I don't know, like the beginning of September. And we expect the House Natural Resources Committee to take action. We expect this bill to be introduced in the House, hopefully this fall. We expect the bill to move into committee in the Senate. They currently have 15 bipartisan co-sponsors. We need more. All the organizations are doing hosted visits with Congress, where we talk to congressional representatives directly about the Recovering America's Wildlife and what it means for us and our state and individually, personally. We're developing sign-on letters where all the partners can make their voices heard and show that unified support for the bill. There's a lot of media efforts to promote the bill. You might see some of those as you're paying attention to the media now that you know a little bit more. We're working hard to make sure that the American people understand the benefit of this bill and can relay that to Congress. And we're working also to capture additional industry support right now. So there's already a ton of industry support for this legislation, but more is good, right? So these are the kinds of things that are happening behind the scenes, in addition to what we need from everyone and what we need from you, which I'll get to in a minute. Also, because Congress is in recess right now, a lot of states and organizations are hosting field tours and summer recess events, trying to get, trying to help people and also help our congressional representatives to see wildlife in person and to experience wildlife directly so that they can feel what this bill means. And one of those, which I'd like to invite everybody to this week, Bat Conservation International and Texas Parks and Wildlife are hosting a Facebook Live event this Thursday from Bracken Cave. So we're going to be at Bracken Cave. We're going to be watching a live bat emergence from the cave. And if you haven't seen the bats emerge from Bracken Cave, you should really join us. It's millions and millions and millions of Mexican free-tail bats that come out of the cave in this crazy bat tornado. And it's truly life-changing. And myself and some of the biologists from Texas Parks and Wildlife are going to be on site talking about the bats, talking about the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and answering questions from people on Facebook Live. So you can just go to BCI's Facebook site at 7:45 Central on Thursday, and the event will be live and you can watch it. Or you can go to our events page, and I think we're going to put the link in the chat, and you can RSVP right now. Like when you get off this webinar, before you forget, you can just go RSVP and be connected to the event directly. And it's really worth it. It's going to be a lot of fun. So you knew this was coming, right? Like we need your help. We need your help, everyone's help. This is going to take all of us to pass the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So we're asking everyone to please contact your senators and your representatives and ask them to support this once in a lifetime landmark legislation for wildlife conservation. Both BCI and the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife have made it really easy to find and email your elected officials. You can go to BCI's website, and I put the link on the slide here, and you can enter your zip code, and our easy tool will tell you who your representatives are if you don't already know, tell you who your senators are, and populate a form so you can email them directly. You can personalize it. I always encourage people to personalize it based on what you've heard today that resonates with you, or whatever other personal experience you want to put in that letter, so that your correspondence doesn't get flagged as, just like a group spam letter. Like, make it personal, and they're more likely to listen to it. We've drafted some language so you can edit that. But you can also pick up the phone and you can call their offices. And if you do, ask to speak to the staff who handles the environmental topics, and just tell them what you think, and encourage those senators and congressional representatives to support this bill, whatever that looks like. We need co-sponsors to get the bill to the floor. We need bipartisan support. Republican support is really, really important. Democratic support is really, really important. And then we need votes. We need votes to pass it once it makes it through committee and gets to the floor. So there are lots of ways that our representatives can support the bill. They can engage in active negotiations. They can tell the leadership that they want this to come forward, and then they can vote for it. So they don't have to wait until there's a vote on the floor. They can advocate in many other ways leading up to that. So it's that easy. The future of bats, really, and all America's wildlife need every single one of us, and we can really use your help. And I'm so glad that you joined us today to learn more about it. And I hope that you will take that next step and go get us some votes. All right, I think that's all I have. Linda, I think I have lots of time for questions. Can you tell me how much time we have, and I can tee them up as much as you like, however you like.
Yeah, so we've got about 25 minutes, so that is perfect though. And we do have some great questions. So let's see here. So Stephanie wants to kind of circle back. She has read something about the Endangered Species Act being in trouble. So what can you explain some more about?
Yeah, I can talk to you a little bit about that. There's a lot going on. Maybe you've seen some things from BCI on that. There's a couple things to pay attention to. The Endangered Species Act is constantly under fire. And there were a lot of regulations that were put forward and modified under the Endangered Species Act under the Trump administration that weakened the protections for the Endangered Species Act. It did things like it modified how we can consider critical habitat. It influenced how and where you have to consider economic impacts and not just the science. So a lot of those Trump era regulations are really problematic for protecting endangered species. And so there is a concerted effort in the conservation community to try and roll back some of those regulations and restore basically the Endangered Species Act to its full and capable self, right? So that's going on. And there's a lot of activity around that right now. Also, there were several bills this spring that used something called the Congressional Review Act, basically to gut agency listings of certain species. And the northern long-eared bat was one of those species. So the Congressional Review Act is a really blunt instrument that has never been used before to reverse an agency decision. And that was very shocking and really unconventional. And so unfortunately, that effort passed both the House and the Senate this spring in May and went to Biden. Now, the Biden administration has vowed publicly to veto it. And so we're hoping that that will hold. But if passed, it would basically remove protections for northern long-eared bats, which are in real trouble because of white nose syndrome, and basically overturn the collective expertise of the Fish and Wildlife Service, who are like agency professionals spending their entire careers learning about these species and making their best scientific decision that these bats are in trouble and headed for extinction. And politically, the Congressional Review Act just removes that. So hopefully it's not signed. We've been pretty active opposing that. And then you're right, the Endangered Species Act is always under fire, but particularly now. It's the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, and there are a lot of people with a lot of different opinions about how effective it's been and how whether or not it needs a revamp. But it's working. I mean, we could have a whole nother presentation on recovery, like successful species recovery under the ESA, in my opinion.
Great. There was a kind of a follow-up question from Elaine. Will any urban environments benefit from the Endangered Species Act?
From the Endangered Species Act or from the Recovering America's Wildlife Act? I'll try and answer both just to take care of her question. So the Endangered Species Act definitely benefits urban environments. There are examples of endangered species that really are surviving within urban habitats. Some species that come to mind, a batty example is the Florida bonneted bat, which the largest population of Florida bonneted bats currently lives in Miami. And so habitat protections in Miami are being helped by the Endangered Species Act and would absolutely be helped by the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Thanks, Elaine. I see your clarification. Yes, the Recovering America's Wildlife would absolutely help urban environments. There's space in the bill for environmental education, for getting people outside, for creating green space that benefits species of conservation need. Bats and people really need the same things. Like we all need clean air, we need clean water, we need healthy habitats, we need healthy ecosystems. And so where those things overlap, they will absolutely be included in urban environments. And every state will be a little bit different. Like you can go look at your state wildlife action plan for your state and look at the species and the priorities listed there, and you'll have some sense of where they might go should the funding come through.
Awesome. So a question from Ryan. Ryan says, I've seen for many years now that quote unquote management and funding either targets 1 to 2 specific species, clear cutting areas to entice a bird such as golden winged warblers, or doing a disturbing new thing, which is selectively cutting mature healthy blocks of forest to quote unquote increase species diversity. I tend to believe that blocking off as large of areas as possible leads to the healthiest forests in areas where imperiled natural life can flourish. Is there a percentage of money that supports this? Is it easier to buy, let's say, 100 acres of land and just leave it alone?
I guess it depends on what's in the state wildlife action plan. The funding certainly doesn't prohibit those activities, but it needs to be focused on the species that are identified in the state wildlife action plan. So the species that are most at risk. And if those species are interior forest species, for example, that probably wouldn't be allowed. But if they're species that need a little bit of edge, then those kinds of activities might bring a little habitat diversity to an otherwise closed canopy. It's hard to say without a specific example, but it doesn't prohibit it for sure, but it really has to be tied to those species of greatest conservation need, which is a very rigorous process to put those plans together. So what I can tell you is that the funding won't be spent like on a whim. Like it's not going to be one biologist's discretion on deciding to do one management activity or another. It's very highly curated and carefully vetted. I don't know if that answers your question, Ryan. Oh, also, let me just also tell you, money is available. You can actually buy land. I mean, they could buy land with it if that was their priority.
So a question from an anonymous viewer: what mechanism ensures oversight on each state wildlife department on how they will spend RAWA funds?
Mm-hmm. So right now, I think it's going to work the same way that state wildlife grants work. So the money comes from Congress to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service allocates and appropriates the money out to the states. And there's a pretty robust reporting process in place for states to report back to the Fish and Wildlife Service how the money was spent, what priorities it identified. And it's a pretty rigorous process. With the state wildlife grant process, which works similar to this now, there's good oversight in my opinion. And it's complicated, and there's a high degree of accountability.
Vicky, Sally's got a question. Is there organized opposition to RAWA?
Not really. Isn't that crazy? Not really. I think the only thing that's holding RAWA up is concern over exactly where the money is going to come from and negotiations on where the money is going to come from. So as you might expect, there are many members of Congress and the Senate who are concerned about spending and concerned about the general fund and wanting to know, how is this bill going to pay for itself without raising fees or taxes? And so really the most complicated negotiations for its passage are not about, that I've seen. I mean, other people may have seen some other things who are more in the trenches than I am on Capitol Hill. But from what I've seen, like the general intention of the bill, generally the way it's structured, has pretty broad support. It's just kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, how are you going to pay for the bill? And exactly what's that going to look like? And then it becomes a negotiation about the details. But no, to my knowledge, there's no formal, like, rallied opposition to this bill, which is kind of unusual and, quite frankly, pretty awesome.
Awesome. So Erica wants to ask, can you reiterate the steps to take and the exact name of the bill we can reference to our elected officials? I'm going to go ahead and paste the link to the page, and I can also share my screen so you can talk about it. So just a moment, I'm going to paste this link in the chat for everyone to look at and click, and I'll share my screen. Just a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. While you're sharing your screen, I'll walk you back through it. So the bill is called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And if you go to BCI's webpage right here, you'll see language that we've put up to make it very easy for you. So you basically just put in your name, your address, phone number, and that allows the system to, like, figure out where you live. And then it'll pop open your senators and representatives. And then you can decide if you want to email them all or just one. And then we've got pre-drafted language here in the email body, the body of the email. And you can edit that, make it personal, say whatever you want, delete it, write your own thing if you so choose. And then just push send, and it goes straight to your congressional representative. Once you know who your representative is, you can also do a quick Google search and find out their phone number. So if you'd rather call, if you're a telephone person, you'd rather talk to a staffer and explain why you want them to support this bill, you can just look up your senator or your representative, and you can just pick up the phone and call them. It's surprisingly easy. When you pick up the phone and call them, they just answer. I always thought it was harder, but it's not. And then you just ask for the staffer that deals with environmental issues, and you leave them a message or you talk to them. I was always a little bit intimidated by this before I did more of it, but it's surprisingly easy. And in every instance, the staffers that I've talked to have always been interested and kind and polite and grateful that I called. Does that give you enough detail? You can kind of see it on the screen here too. And the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife, which is ournatureusa.org, they also have a thing where you can write your congressman as well. So there's a couple different ways that you could do it, but we'd love for you to do it on behalf of bats.
Yeah. All righty. And that kind of also answers a few other questions that we had. Vicky's got a question. Does the funding program do anything to eliminate invasive species?
Yes, if the invasive species are a threat to a species that's identified as a species of special conservation need. So for example, if I'm making this up because I don't know like the details off the top of my head, but say there's like an endangered plant, riparian plant, for example, that is being overrun and jeopardized by invasive tamarisk, for example, in a southwestern stream, then I can imagine tamarisk removal would be part of the recovery for that species, and then it would include invasive species removal. I don't know that just like blanket invasive species removal would be a priority, but it would be if it was associated with a priority species and its recovery or stabilization.
Awesome. And then so a question from Tim, more on white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome was recently detected in Colorado and is expected to spread in forested residential areas. We try to clean up dead wood and trees for fire mitigation, but I read that dead trees and snags are great habitat for bats. Do you have any recommendations for supporting bat populations in preparation for the spread of disease while also trying to recover our forests?
Yes, I do. Thank you for asking that. I am also a Colorado resident. So hello, fellow Coloradan. And it was also very hard to hear white nose syndrome making it to Colorado. I mean, we knew it would happen, right? But it's here. So yeah, absolutely. Like forest heterogeneity is generally very good for bats. And bats, absolutely what you read is true. A lot of species really do use snags and dead and decaying trees. They tuck in up underneath the bark. It makes a really nice roost. They use cracks and crevices and cavities inside those trees. Dying trees, and I'm sure you're dealing, depending on where you are in Colorado, you may be dealing with pine beetle stuff. A lot of those decaying trees or dying trees are also hosts to so many insects. Like the insect community for bat foraging is also really significant. So my best advice would be clear the trees where you need to clear the trees for safety reasons and leave the rest. So if you have a lot of property, I mean, you got to do your safety thing. Don't leave dead trees hanging over your shed or a road or the place where your kids play or whatever those safety reasons are. You got to take care of that. But in those other areas in the matrix, let the forest decay naturally to the best of your ability. And if you're in like a pine beetle outbreak area where you just have a lot to deal with, just maybe see if you can find a happy medium. Leave some for the bats. It'll really make a big difference. So for white nose syndrome, the healthier and the fatter the bats can go into hibernation in the winter. Even if they encounter white nose syndrome, the more likely it will be for them to survive. So what we really want to be able to do is provide the healthiest habitats we can to bats leading up to their hibernation period of time, which means lots of insects for them to eat, lots of places for them to roost without having to travel so far and use up all that energy to go back and forth between where they're eating and drinking and roosting, and just allowing them to go into hibernation fat, because fat bats survive better, is what we are seeing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my best shot.
All right, so two kind of linked questions. So an anonymous viewer has stated that, we should really be confronting Congress about why roughly 5% of Americans who buy hunting, trapping, and fishing licenses exclusively control wildlife governance and projects. And then from Susan as well, what are the options for funding RAWA? Will there be taxes on outdoor equipment to generate new funds? What are the other options?
So yes, we should be confronting Congress. Yes, like that's what we're trying to do. This is the problem. This is the problem we're trying to solve, right? We need funding, dedicated funding, not annually appropriated, always changing funding, but like sufficient dedicated funding for things like frogs and bats and insects and plants. Like those species have been falling through the cracks. So yes, absolutely. Like, let's do it. Also, I don't know the answer to your second question right now. Right now, the bill does not include taxes on like an associated tax on outdoor recreational equipment. We tried that in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and it just didn't get the traction we needed because there was a lot of opposition to increased taxes. And I think that will probably still be the case. So my guess is that it will not include that provision, but we're early in the process. Again, in this 118th Congress. So it's been introduced in the Senate. We're waiting introduction in the House. And if you follow these things, sometimes bills get modified and then the House and the Senate bill will be different and then they have to reconcile them. So I'm not saying it's out of the question. It's just it's not in there right now, to the best of my knowledge. If anybody's on the call from AFWA who's sort of on the Hill in the middle of it and something different, please pop it in the chat and let us know.
So last question, going back to white nose syndrome from Taylor, I believe they said their name was. Malia, have you ever seen a bat with white nose syndrome? And what bat species is getting white nose syndrome the most?
I have, unfortunately. I don't like to think about it. All of our hibernating bats are susceptible to white nose syndrome. So I'll just give you like a super quick primer on it. And if you'd like to learn more, you can go to our website, or maybe, Linda, there may be a white nose syndrome bat chat in the future you should attend. But basically, white nose syndrome is a disease of hibernating bats. And when bats, basically when they slow down their metabolism to enter into hibernation for the winter, they become vulnerable to the fungus that causes this disease. When they're awake and euthermic, they're not really at risk. It's when they hibernate that they become at risk. And so the bats that hibernate the longest, the bats that go into hibernation the earliest in the fall and come out the latest in the spring, and the bats with the smallest body sizes are the ones that are most impacted. So a lot of the Myotis species like northern long-eared bats, species like little brown bats, which used to be a super common species all over the US. And now they're seeing population declines, approaching 90%. And I guarantee you, many of people on this call that are bat lovers who used to have bats in their barns and their attics in the Midwest and the Northeast primarily, like so many of those were little brown bats, and I bet they're gone now. I bet you don't have them. So a lot of the small Myotis species that hibernate for long periods of time really are taking a big hit. Some of the larger bodied hibernating bats are also being impacted by white nose syndrome, but their population declines are not as drastic, maybe because their body size sort of buffers them from the worst effects of it. And then bats that don't hibernate in caves and mines and rocks have been detected. Some of them have been detected with the fungus, but they don't seem to be experiencing disease. So a lot of the migratory bats, like red bats and hoary bats, are not really experiencing population impacts from white nose syndrome because of just the way that they move through the world, their ecology. And then tropical bats typically aren't, we don't expect to be impacted either because they're awake year round. They don't really hibernate.
Okay, well, that was our last question. Thank you again, Malia, for educating us on RAWA and what we can be doing as a community to try and help bats and the environment around us. Thank you as well to the audience for joining us, to watch our Facebook Live about emergence at Bracken Cave this Thursday, August 24th, 7:45 p.m. Central. You can go to our Facebook page and you can RSVP there. We'll also be making an announcement very soon about other ways that you can watch bats live. So make sure you're signed up for our newsletter and email list. To learn more about RAWA, visit our website at batcon.org. That's batcon.org. And again, subscribe to our mailing list and newsletter to learn, to hear all about the latest updates about RAWA, ESA, watching bats, and all of that. That's where you'll hear about future webinars as well and the work that we do. I can say that next month we'll have a webinar about prepping your bat garden for the fall. And then in October, we'll have one about white nose syndrome. So if you have lots more questions about white nose syndrome, definitely want to come to the October bat chat. So this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in about a week. Just search at Bat Conservation on YouTube and you'll see us. So any final words for us, Malia?
Just thank you. Thank you for caring. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning about this bill. And thank you for participating in your public right as a you know, a person in the United States. Like, go tell those guys what you think. Let's save some bats.
Definitely. All right, so that's all for now, folks. I hope everyone loves bats even more than they did an hour ago, and we'll see you at the next bat chat.